The Apache widow went up for sale with the cattle until the ranchers said she's priceless. Maria Alvarez woke up before the sun every morning, as she had done for most of her life. But desert air was crisp and quiet, broken only by the low hum of the wind across the dry grass and the distant calls of birds waking from the night. Her small ranch sat on the edge of a dusty Arizona plain, a stretch of land she had loved fiercely ever since she could remember. But today, as she opened the door of her weathered wooden house, she felt a heavy weight pressing on her chest. The loss of her husband, Jorge, still echoed in every corner of the homestead, and the daily struggles of running the ranch alone felt heavier than ever. Jorge had been everything to Maria. He was not only her husband, but also her partner, her closest friend, and her guide in the difficult life of cattle ranching. He had a way of knowing exactly what needed to be done, whether it was tending to the herd, fixing the fence, or calming the animals during a storm. Maria remembered the early mornings when they would ride out together, checking each cow with patient hands and gentle voices. His laughter had been her favorite sound, a warm melody that made even the harshest days feel lighter. But a year ago, that laughter had been silenced by a sudden accident. Since that day, the ranch had felt emptier, as if the land itself mourned his absence. Maria did her best to keep things running. She learned to mend the fences herself, feed the cattle, and even sell the occasional calf at the market. But the work was grueling, and the hours were long. There were days when she would stand in the sun, wiping sweat from her brow, and simply wish that someone could share the burden with her. Her neighbors were kind, but they had their own farms and families to care for. She couldn't ask them to carry her grief too. Maria's children had grown and moved to the city for school and work. They visited when they could, bringing laughter and stories from their lives, but the heart of the ranch, the everyday work and responsibility, remained hers alone. The bills were piling up, and with the drought hitting the region harder than it had in decades, the land produced less and less. The cattle required more care, and yet their value on the market had dropped. Maria spent long nights poring over the accounts, trying to figure out how she could keep the ranch alive. Each calculation, each number she wrote down, seemed to tighten a knot in her chest. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Maria made the decision that would change everything. She had always believed that the land, the cattle, and the life she had built were worth fighting for, no matter how hard. But now she realized that fighting alone was no longer enough. Her love for the ranch was deep, but the reality was unavoidable. Without help, without resources, the ranch might fail entirely. She decided to put the ranch and the cattle up for sale. It was not an easy choice. It felt like giving up a part of herself, a betrayal of the life she had shared with Jorge. The next morning, Maria walked among the herd, her hands grazing the soft fur of the cattle she had raised since they were calves. Each one carried a memory. The brown cow she had nursed through a difficult birth, the black calf Jorge had named after her favorite song, the old bull who had stubbornly refused to be led until Maria had spent hours earning his trust. These animals were not just property, they were family. And yet she knew that selling them was necessary if she wanted to survive. As she prepared the papers for the auction, Maria felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear of being judged, fear of losing her independence, fear of being alone in the world. But relief too, because the burden she had carried for so long would finally be shared, and perhaps someone else could give the ranch the care it needed. She packed her belongings carefully, every item a reminder of life with Jorge. She included old photographs, his tools, and even his worn cowboy hat, which she placed gently atop the desk in the small office of the ranch. The day of the auction arrived, and Maria drove the dusty road to town, the trailer full of the cattle she had tended to with so much love. The town square was alive with the energy of the sale. Farmers and ranchers, buyers from nearby towns, and curious onlookers who had come to see the widow who was selling her livelihood. Maria felt every pair of eyes on her as she stepped out of her truck. She straightened her back and walked with the quiet confidence she had carried through her life, though inside her heart pounded with anxiety. The auctioneer greeted her politely, but with the brisk efficiency of someone used to business. "All right, folks," he called, his voice booming across the square. Today we have some fine cattle, and we also have a ranch with everything included: land, livestock, and management. Step right up and place your bids." The crowd murmured, and Maria's stomach twisted. She felt the sting of humiliation, as though her life, her labor, and her love for the land were being measured like a simple commodity. She reminded herself to stay calm, to stay strong. She had always faced challenges with courage, and this day would be no different. As the cattle were led one by one into the pen, Maria told herself stories to keep her mind steady. Each animal was important, each represented years of dedication, each carried a memory. She whispered to the brown calf, "I know you'll go to a good home," and patted the old bull's head, saying, "Take care of the land for me." The auction was moving faster than she anticipated, and soon it was her turn. The auctioneer looked at her and said, "And now the Apache widow herself, offering her skills, knowledge, and care of the land as part of the package. Who will start the bidding?" Maria felt every eye in the square upon her, and a flush of embarrassment swept over her. She wanted to explain that she was more than a price, that her life experiences and knowledge of the land could not be quantified. But she stayed silent, holding herself upright and letting the world judge her. Inside, she told herself that she had made the right choice, that selling the ranch and starting anew, though painful, might be the only way forward. Hours passed, and one by one the cattle found new owners. Some went to large ranches where they would continue to be raised with care. Others went to smaller farms where they might become part of someone else's family. Maria watched with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She felt the emptiness in the corral as each animal was led away, but she also felt a strange lightness, as if a small burden had been lifted from her shoulders. By the end of the day, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town square. Maria had sold the cattle, the land was ready to be transferred, and she was left standing alone with her thoughts. It was in this quiet moment, as she looked out across the fading light, that she realized the auction was not the end, it was a beginning. She had faced the loss of her husband, the weight of responsibility, and the fear of judgment. She had made a choice, difficult though it was, and she had survived. Maria's story was not just about loss. It was about strength, resilience, and the courage to make hard decisions. She had learned that life on the ranch, like life itself, was unpredictable. But she had also learned that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. The auction had tested her, but it had also shown her that she could endure, that she could rise each morning and face the world, no matter how difficult it became. As she packed her few remaining belongings into her old truck and drove back to the empty ranch, Maria felt a quiet determination settle in her heart. She might have lost the herd, and she might have been measured by the dollar value of her labor, but she had not lost herself. And in that realization, there was a sense of hope, a small, steady flame that promised new beginnings, new challenges, and a life rebuilt on her own terms. The morning of the auction dawned clear and bright, with the sun slowly rising over the wide Arizona plains. The heat had not yet begun to press down, and the air smelled faintly of dust and dry grass. Maria Alvarez drove her old, rust-speckled truck toward the town square, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The trailer behind her rattled slightly with the herd of cattle she had raised for years. Each bump of the road made her stomach tighten. Today was the day that everything she had worked for, everything she had loved, would be measured by the judgment of strangers. She arrived early, hoping to organize the animals and settle her nerves before the crowd arrived. The square was already buzzing with activity. Farmers and ranchers from nearby towns were setting up stalls, inspecting the animals, and chatting in low, serious voices. Children ran between the legs of adults, laughing and playing, unaware of the tension that filled the air. Maria felt her chest tighten as she opened the trailer and began to carefully guide the cattle into their pens. Each animal seemed to sense the nervous energy, shifting their weight and calling softly to one another. Maria took a deep breath and began walking among them, checking each cow's condition, brushing dust from their hides, and whispering reassurances. "It's going to be okay," she murmured to a brown cow with a gentle temperament. "Someone will take care of you." She stopped by a black calf she had raised from birth, its large eyes looking up at her. She crouched down and stroked its head, feeling the softness of its fur and the warmth of its small body. "I hope you find a good home," she said quietly. By mid-morning, the crowd had grown larger. People from surrounding towns had arrived, bringing with them a mixture of curiosity and businesslike determination. Some whispered among themselves about the Apache widow who was selling her ranch, while others focused on the livestock, evaluating them carefully. Maria could feel the weight of their eyes, their judgments, their quiet assumptions. She straightened her back and reminded herself that she had faced hardship before and survived. She could do this too. The auctioneer, a tall man with a booming voice and a sharp eye for business, stepped up to the platform. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have a fine selection of cattle today, and we also have a special opportunity, a ranch for sale with all livestock and management included. Step right up and place your bids." His voice echoed across the square, carrying both excitement and authority. The bidding began slowly. The smaller cattle sold first, moving from pen to pen with careful handlers guiding them. Maria watched each sale with mixed emotions. Relief mingled with sorrow as she saw the animals she had nurtured going to new homes. She tried not to think about the years she had spent raising them, the long nights when she had stayed up to care for a sick calf, or the mornings she had spent walking the pastures with Jorge by her side. Now, those memories were hers alone. When it came time for the larger, more valuable cows, the bidding grew more competitive. Ranchers raised their hands, calling out numbers, negotiating with each other over who would take home which animal. Maria's eyes followed each transaction, noting where each animal was going. Her heart lifted slightly when she saw that the buyer seemed competent and respectful. At least the cattle would be cared for. Finally, the auctioneer's voice shifted, drawing attention to the next item. "And now," he announced, "we have something truly unique." The Apache widow herself, offering her knowledge, experience, and management skills along with the ranch. "Who will bid?" A hush fell over the square. Maria felt the heat of 1,000 gazes upon her. Her stomach twisted, and she swallowed hard. This moment was unlike any other in her life. She had always taken pride in her work, in her ability to manage the ranch and care for the animals. But now, she was being treated as though she were a commodity, something to be bought and sold. It was humiliating, and yet she stood tall, refusing to show fear. Some in the crowd whispered, "Can you believe they're auctioning her off?"
One man murmured,
"I've never heard of such a thing!" Others nodded, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Maria ignored them. She had faced gossip and judgment before. Today she would face it again, with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every challenge. A few hands raised slowly, tentative bids called out for her services. Maria felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Pride because someone recognized her worth, her expertise. Sadness because her life was being measured in numbers rather than respect. She looked out across the square, her eyes scanning the crowd, searching for someone who understood her beyond the price tag. Then, from the back of the square, a tall man stepped forward. He was older, weathered by years under the sun, with hands that spoke of labor and experience. His eyes were sharp, and he watched Maria not with curiosity, but with careful attention. He raised his hand, not with a number, but with a simple declaration. "She's priceless," he said. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. Others looked at him with confusion. The auctioneer paused, uncertain how to proceed. The man's voice carried clearly across the square. "I'm not bidding a number," he explained. "I'm saying that her knowledge, her skill, and her heart cannot be measured in money. I want to work with her, not buy her as property." She had expected judgment, ridicule, and calculation, but this was something different. Someone had seen her not as a commodity, but as a person. The man, whose name she would later learn was Tom Harrison, stepped closer. He explained that he owned a neighboring ranch, and that he had seen the way she managed her herd, how she cared for the land, and how she spoke to the animals. He wanted a partnership. Someone who could guide the ranch with expertise and integrity. The crowd remained silent, watching the exchange with growing interest. Maria listened carefully, her heart pounding. She had dreamed of help, of partnership, of someone who understood the life she had built, but she had never imagined it would come in this way. She nodded slowly, feeling a mixture of relief and cautious hope. Over the next few hours, Maria and Tom discussed the details. He asked about the land, the water sources, and the history of the herd. He listened attentively as Maria spoke, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine respect for her experience. The auctioneer looked on, clearly unsure how to proceed, but the crowd had shifted. What began as a typical sale had transformed into something deeper, a recognition of value that went beyond money. By midday, the decision was clear. Maria would work with Tom, bringing her knowledge and dedication to the neighboring ranch. It was not a sale in the traditional sense. It was a partnership, built on mutual respect and shared vision. Maria felt a lightness in her chest that she had not felt in months. The weight of fear, loneliness, and uncertainty began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose and possibility. As they shook hands, Maria realized that the auction had taught her something important. Life on the ranch, and life in general, was unpredictable. Hardship could arrive at any moment, and loss was inevitable. But so too could hope, kindness, and unexpected opportunities. Today, she had been measured, judged, and tested, and she had discovered that her true worth was not in what she owned, but in who she was. The rest of the day passed quickly. Maria helped guide the remaining cattle to their new owners, feeling a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Each transaction was a reminder of the years she had spent nurturing these animals and the love she had poured into her work. But she also felt the beginnings of something new, a path forward that promised growth, collaboration, and the chance to rebuild a life that had been fractured by loss. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting golden light across the square, Maria and Tom walked together among the pens. They discussed plans for the future, sharing ideas about pasture rotation, herd management, and water conservation. Maria found herself smiling, genuinely and freely, for the first time in months. She had faced a moment of potential humiliation and turned it into an opportunity for partnership and respect. That evening, as Maria returned to her empty ranch, she felt a quiet sense of hope. The auction had been difficult, challenging, and emotional, but it had also revealed something profound. Her value was not defined by circumstance, fear, or loss. It was defined by her resilience, her skill, and her willingness to persevere. She had sold the cattle, faced the judgment of strangers, and emerged stronger. And now, with the promise of a new partnership, she could look forward to the future with confidence. Maria sat on the porch of her small house, watching the last rays of sunlight fade over the desert. The land was quiet, peaceful, and waiting. The auction had been a turning point, a moment that had tested her limits and shown her that she was capable of more than she had imagined. She thought of Jorge, of the life they had built together, and of the new possibilities that lay ahead. A small smile curved her lips. Life was unpredictable, yes, but it was also full of potential, and she was ready to face it head-on. The morning sun rose over the desert, spilling golden light across the wide, dusty plains. Maria Alvarez was already awake, walking through the pens where the remaining cattle grazed quietly. The land felt different today, alive with possibility instead of only the weight of responsibility. Yesterday's auction had been a turning point, and today she would meet the man who had changed everything, Tom Harrison. Tom had arrived early, his pickup truck kicking up clouds of dust as he drove onto the ranch. He was tall and sturdy, with weathered skin that spoke of years under the sun, and eyes that were both sharp and kind. From the moment he stepped out, he carried an air of quiet confidence, not arrogance, but the kind of assurance that comes from knowing one's own strength and experience. Maria watched him from the porch, her heart beating with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She had learned long ago that not everyone who offered help could be trusted. Tom approached slowly, tipping his hat in greeting. "Morning, Maria," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I hope I'm not too early." Maria smiled faintly, stepping down to meet him. No, you're right on time. There's a lot to see and talk about. Her voice carried a mixture of warmth and careful reserve. She was naturally polite, but she had learned to protect herself in moments of uncertainty. The two of them walked across the ranch together. Maria pointed out the pastures, the water troughs, and the pens where the cattle had spent years growing strong. She spoke quietly but clearly, explaining the needs of the herd, the habits of the land, and the routine she had followed since she was a young girl. Tom listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions, not interrupting or making assumptions. You really know this land well, he said finally, pausing to look across the horizon where the desert stretched endlessly. I can see why the auction didn't do you justice. Someone like you can't be measured by a number or a bid. Maria felt a warmth rise in her chest. His words were simple, but they carried honesty. For so long, she had felt invisible, reduced to a worker, a widow, a seller of cattle. Tom was seeing her as a person, as someone with value beyond what could be weighed or counted. They moved from one pasture to the next, discussing the cattle individually. Maria pointed out the brown cow she had nursed through a difficult birth and the black calf that had grown up strong under her care. She explained each animal's temperament, health, and history. Tom nodded, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather notebook. He asked questions about grazing patterns, soil conditions, and water sources. Maria found herself relaxing in his presence. He was thorough but kind, interested but respectful. As they walked, Maria shared stories of her life on the ranch, how she and Jorge had built it from scratch, the long hours, the storms they had endured, and the small victories that made each day worthwhile. Tom listened quietly, never interrupting, never judging. He seemed to understand that her connection to the land was deeper than profit, that it was tied to memory, love, and identity. You've been through a lot, Tom said finally, stopping to lean against a fence post. His eyes met hers with a seriousness that made Maria pause. I can see the strength in you, but also the care. You don't just manage land and cattle, you nurture them. Maria swallowed hard. She wasn't used to compliments, especially ones that saw beyond her work.
I do what I can, she said quietly, looking down at her boots. I've had to.
It's not always easy. Tom nodded, his gaze sweeping over the pasture. I can imagine. And I know it's not just about the work. It's about the history, the memories, the people who came before. I respect that. I want you to know that I'm serious about working together. Not just about the land, but about building something strong, together. Maria felt a spark of cautious hope. The fear she had carried since the auction, the fear of being undervalued, misunderstood, or taken advantage of, began to ease. Tom's sincerity was clear, and it was refreshing. She had spent months, maybe years, being alone in her struggles. For the first time, she felt the possibility of partnership, of shared responsibility, and of respect for her knowledge and experience. They continued their walk, discussing the practical aspects of working together. Tom had plans for expanding grazing areas, improving water access, and introducing small innovations to make the ranch more sustainable. Maria offered her insight, suggesting rotation schedules for the cattle, ways to preserve the soil, and techniques to strengthen the fences. Tom listened to each idea, nodding thoughtfully, often asking for clarification but never dismissing her advice. As the morning turned to midday, the sun climbed high and cast sharp shadows across the land. Maria and Tom paused near the edge of a large pasture, where the view stretched for miles. The wind swept across the plain, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and distant sagebrush. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the familiar smells and sounds. The ranch was hers in spirit, even if ownership was no longer defined in the same way. You know, Tom said softly, breaking the quiet. I've managed ranches for years and I've met a lot of people, but I can tell you I've never met anyone like you. Most people would have given up after what you went through. You kept going. Maria felt a lump in her throat. She had never thought of herself as extraordinary. She had just survived. But his words, simple as they were, carried truth. She had survived not just by brute strength, but by care, dedication, and love for the land and the animals she had tended for so long. They spent the afternoon walking the ranch, examining the water sources and inspecting the fences for weaknesses. Maria shared her knowledge of the seasonal changes, the patterns of rainfall, and the behavior of the cattle throughout the year. Tom listened, asked questions, and occasionally offered his own insights. The conversation flowed naturally, a blend of technical discussion, shared observations, and moments of quiet reflection. At one point, they stopped by a small shed where Maria kept her tools. She opened the door and showed him the careful organization she had maintained over the years, everything in its place, ready for use. Tom looked impressed, not at the neatness, but at the thought and care behind it. "You've built this with your hands and your heart," he said. "That's something you can't buy or sell." Maria smiled faintly. She realized that, for the first time in months, she felt a sense of belonging not just to the land, but to the possibility of partnership. Tom was not just another buyer, another stranger. He was someone who recognized her worth, her skill, and her dedication. As the day wore on, they sat together on a fallen log, sharing a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and fruit. The conversation turned from work to life, stories of childhood, of family, of lessons learned from hardship. Maria felt herself opening up in a way she had not allowed in a long time. Tom listened with genuine interest, asking questions that encouraged her to reflect, to share, and to trust. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, Maria realized that her fears were slowly fading. The man beside her was steady, reliable, and sincere. He did not see her as someone to be bought or measured. He saw her as a partner, an equal, and a person of value. "I think we could do a lot together," Tom said finally, standing and stretching. "Your knowledge, my resources. We could build something strong, lasting. And the cattle will thrive, the land will thrive, and you won't have to carry it all alone anymore." Maria nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest.
I'd like that,
she said softly. "I think we can make this work." They walked back toward the main house together, the evening light casting long shadows across the pasture. Maria felt a sense of calm and hope she hadn't experienced in a long time. The ranch was still hers in spirit, and now, for the first time, she felt that it could also be a place of partnership, respect, and shared effort. That night, as Maria sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge one by one in the clear desert sky, she reflected on the day. The auction, which had once felt like a moment of humiliation, had led her to something unexpected: trust, respect, and a new beginning. She thought of Jorge and the life they had built together, and she felt a quiet sense of gratitude. The land still held memories of the past, but now it also held hope for the future. Maria realized that true strength was not just in surviving hardship, but in recognizing opportunity, accepting help, and trusting in others when the heart allowed it. Tom Harrison was more than a rancher. He was a partner, someone who valued her for who she was, not what she owned. And for the first time in a long while, Maria allowed herself to imagine the possibilities of a life rebuilt with trust, cooperation, and shared purpose. The morning sun bathed the ranch in a warm golden glow, and Maria Alvarez stood at the edge of the main pasture, breathing in the fresh desert air. The land, once heavy with the memory of loss, now seemed alive with possibility. It had been weeks since the auction, and every day had brought small, meaningful changes. The quiet tension that had filled her mornings was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of work, cooperation, and the kind of companionship she hadn't felt in months. Tom Harrison had arrived early again, as he had every day since their agreement to work together. He moved through the ranch with a quiet confidence, his hands skilled and steady as he repaired fences, checked water sources, and guided the cattle through their routines. Maria admired his patience and his attention to detail, and she realized that their partnership was not simply practical. It was a meeting of minds, a blending of experience and care. "Morning, Maria!" Tom called from across the pasture, his voice carrying easily in the cool air. "Morning," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. She adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and walked toward him, feeling the warmth of the sun on her back. There was a comfort in his presence, a quiet reassurance that she hadn't realized she needed. They began the day's work together, checking the water troughs and inspecting the fences for weak spots. Maria pointed out areas where the soil was beginning to dry too much, explaining how the cattle tended to move in those sections and which areas needed more shade or water. Tom listened carefully, asking questions that showed not only interest but respect for her knowledge. "You know," Tom said as they leaned against a fence, watching the herd move across the pasture, "I've managed ranches my whole life, but I've never met someone who understands cattle the way you do. You have a connection that can't be taught." It's clear why the auction couldn't put a price on that.
Maria felt warmth in her chest.
She had always known she was good at what she did, but it was rare to hear someone acknowledge it without judgment or expectation.
I just know how to care for them, she said softly, almost shyly.
I've spent years learning their ways, watching, listening, and adjusting. That's all. Tom shook his head gently.
It's more than that. It's patience, attention, and heart.
That's why I wanted to work with you, not just to have someone manage the land, but to build something that lasts. They repaired fences together, guided the cattle into different grazing areas, and checked the water lines. As they worked, Maria found herself speaking freely, sharing stories of her childhood on the ranch, the lessons Jorge had taught her, and the small victories that had made every challenge worthwhile. Tom listened without interruption, his expression one of genuine curiosity and respect. By midday, they paused for lunch under the shade of a lone mesquite tree. Maria had packed simple food, bread, cheese, and a few fresh fruits. They sat on the ground, leaning against the tree trunk, sharing bites and conversation. Tom told stories of his own life, of his family and the ranch he had grown up on, and of the lessons he had learned from years of experience. Maria laughed quietly at some of his tales, and he chuckled at hers, the sound carrying across the quiet pasture.
I never expected the auction to turn out like it did, Maria admitted as they watched the cattle graze.
I thought it would be humiliating, and at first it was, but then you stepped forward, and things changed. Tom nodded.
I could see your value, Maria.
Not in what could be sold, but in what you give. Your knowledge, your care, your dedication. They're worth more than any dollar amount. I wanted to make sure you knew that.
She had carried the fear of being undervalued for so long, and hearing those words spoken with such sincerity was overwhelming.
Thank you, she whispered, her voice soft but steady.
I wasn't sure anyone could understand that. The afternoon brought new challenges. A storm had been predicted, and the sky darkened with heavy clouds as wind began to sweep across the plains. Maria and Tom worked quickly to bring the cattle into shelter and secure the fences against possible damage. It was physically exhausting, but Maria found herself energized by the sense of teamwork. Tom's calm guidance and steady hands made the work easier, and she realized that sharing responsibility didn't diminish her strength. It enhanced it. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Maria stood beside Tom, watching the herd huddle together under the shelter. The sound of rain on the dry earth was comforting, a steady rhythm that seemed to soothe the tension that had built over the past months. "Looks like we'll have a good drink of water soon," Maria said, smiling faintly. Tom chuckled. "And maybe a little break from the dust. But I'd rather work with you in this weather than with anyone else." Maria laughed, a genuine carefree sound that surprised her. For the first time in a long while, she felt free. Not weighed down by grief or fear, but lifted by the knowledge that she had support, respect, and partnership. After the storm passed, the two walked the pasture again, checking for any damage. The land glistened with moisture, and the air smelled fresh and clean. Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she observed the herd moving contentedly across the refreshed grass. She realized that the ranch, once a place of struggle and isolation, was becoming a place of life, energy, and collaboration. Over the following weeks, their partnership grew stronger. Maria and Tom developed a routine that balanced work with conversation, problem-solving with laughter, and strategy with reflection. They planned improvements to the ranch together, rotating pastures to prevent overgrazing, reinforcing fences to protect the cattle, and creating small water reservoirs for dry seasons. Maria found herself inspired by Tom's ideas and experience. while he was equally inspired by her knowledge, dedication, and insight. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink over the plains, Maria stood on the porch of the ranch house watching the cattle move slowly across the pasture. Tom joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to her with a smile, and she accepted it gratefully. "You've turned this place around," he said softly, looking out over the land. "It's still yours, Maria. You've nurtured it, cared for it, and now it's stronger because of both of us." Maria nodded, taking a sip of her tea. "It feels different," she admitted. "I used to feel so alone here. Now, it feels like the land itself is alive again. And not just the land, the ranch feels alive because we're working together." Tom smiled. "I think it's more than that. You found someone who respects you, and you found someone who sees the value you bring. That's something rare." Maria felt a quiet warmth in her chest. She had faced months of uncertainty, grief, and fear, and now she realized that those experiences had led her here, to trust, partnership, and a new chapter of her life. The past still mattered. The memories of Jorge still lived within her, but they were no longer chains that held her back. They were part of the foundation upon which she could build something new. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch flourished under their combined care. The cattle thrived, the land recovered from the drought, and the work, while still challenging, became a source of satisfaction rather than struggle. Maria found joy in the rhythm of daily life, in the quiet moments when the sun touched the horizon, in the laughter shared with Tom as they solved problems or reminisced about their lives. One morning, as Maria walked among the pastures, she paused to watch a group of calves playing in the soft grass. She smiled, thinking of how far she had come, from the fear and uncertainty of the auction to the stability and hope she now felt. The ranch was no longer just a place of survival. It was a place of life, growth, and potential. Tom approached her from the distance, waving. "Time to check the water tanks," he called. Maria laughed softly and walked toward him, feeling a sense of contentment she hadn't known in years. Together, they inspected the tanks, adjusted the irrigation, and ensured the cattle had access to clean water. The work was steady, reliable, and fulfilling, and Maria realized that this was exactly what she had needed. Not just help, but partnership, respect, and trust. As the sun set again over the desert, casting long shadows and painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Maria felt a deep sense of peace. The auction, which had once seemed like a moment of loss and humiliation, had brought her to this place of strength, trust, and hope. She thought of Jorge and the life they had shared, and she felt gratitude rather than sorrow. She had honored his memory by persevering, by refusing to give up, and by opening herself to new possibilities. Maria realized that her life had been measured not by what she owned, but by what she gave, her care, her knowledge, her resilience, and her heart. And now, with Tom by her side, she could continue to give while also receiving support, respect, and companionship. That night, as she sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, Maria smiled quietly to herself. She had survived loss, weathered hardship, and faced judgment. She had sold her cattle, shared her story, and found a partner who valued her not for what she could provide, but for who she was. The future was uncertain, as it always would be, but for the first time in a long while she felt ready to meet it, not with fear, but with hope, strength, and confidence. The ranch, once a place of struggle and solitude, had become a symbol of resilience, partnership, and new beginnings. Maria Alvarez, the Apache widow who had once been offered for sale, had discovered her true value was beyond price. And as the gentle night wind swept across the plains carrying the scent of sage and fresh grass, she knew that this was only the beginning of a life rebuilt on trust, respect, and enduring strength.